It was just one sentence 20 years ago.
We'll continue our efforts to bring new partners in Africa and elsewhere into the community of market democracies.
It was the first time an American president talked of Africans as partners. Presidents Bush and Obama wholeheartedly embraced that narrative. Will the new U.S. administration continue focusing on strong economic partnerships with Africa? And as Africa takes charge of its own narrative, does it even matter? Hello, I'm Carol Pineau. Welcome to our special series, Africa and the Trump Administration. For me, this topic is personal. President Clinton's speech 20 years ago changed the way I reported on Africa. And it wasn't just me. Reporters all over the world began to see Africa differently. That is the power of the presidency. President Clinton became the first sitting American president to visit Africa, and the press corps followed along, reporting a narrative of an African renaissance. President George W. Bush ramped it up, becoming the first American president to visit Africa in his first term. Again, the media and the narrative followed along. Then President Obama launched the U.S.-Africa Summit, attended by almost all African leaders, ensuring a week of nonstop coverage on Africa by almost every American news outlet. And yet, of Trump's nearly 30,000 tweets sent out before becoming president, only about 50 were on Africa. Of those, 40 were on Ebola. The others, crime and corruption. The world, and particularly the media, is far more complex today. Does an American president's engagement with Africa still have an impact on the narrative? We have a great panel with us today. We have Tony Fratto, managing partner at Hamilton Strategies and former deputy press secretary for President George Bush. Rahel Getachew, CEO and founder of Afro Lahar, and Ambassador Omar Aruna, CEO of Global Specialty and former ambassador of the Republic of Benin. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So, Tony, if I could start with you, since you were part of shaping that narrative for President Bush, what goes into it?
Well, I think what was important to remember at that time is that President Bush himself was very interested in what was happening in Africa. It was hard to ignore the numbers in terms of HIV in Africa. And he also had a very important sense that we needed to be trading more with Africa, so it brought a lot of attention.
You know, certainly I have seen footage of African leaders, one after another, coming to the White House.
Yeah, they were regular visits from African leaders to the White House. I think almost on a weekly basis, and many came back multiple times, which was I think really important also, because you don't want a one episode, one-off visit. You want a dialogue and trust to develop.
Not a photo op.
Exactly. It can't just be a photo op. It has to be a trusting relationship. And I think that was important.
Rahel, you have worked so much on changing the narrative on Africa. How do you see things with the new administration? Do you have concerns?
Well, again, as you said at the beginning, at the introduction, he's at the infancy stage. So he just started. So we have to give it some time for them to understand the scope of Africa, the stakeholders, and at the same time craft a strategy based on the vision that the president has. The president has said, I want to make America great again. So therefore, it's somewhat a message of protectionist, saying this is what we want to focus, so inward. So within that inward, the president is gradually going to have to craft his Africa strategy, because it is to the benefit of the U.S. in any case.
Making any nation great again in this global world, it has to go to Africa.
Indeed.
There is no way about it. I don't want Africa to become an afterthought of the overall global policy for the new administration.
In talking about America first and pushing that agenda, does that make it so that Americans no longer look towards Africa? Does it have an effect that trickles down?
We've gone through this. We've gone through these kinds of periods before. We should remember, and even going back to Clinton administration. So after the Cold War and Clinton administration comes in, there was a retrenchment in the United States in terms of thinking about the world, and that included Africa. Most people cite, what happened in Rwanda with, American hands-off at that time. If it's America great, it means America leading in all parts of the world, and that includes Africa. And the Clinton administration came back to that effort, and the Bush administration, picked up from there. But it wasn't obvious that the Bush administration would be at this time in the Bush administration.
No one expected
was not at all
it.
obvious.
And then he went so gung-ho.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting, I think, that a lot of times the narrative ends up, the president can do things that filter down, and there's a trickle down, but then there's also the power of the people. The people can say, no, it's wrong that we didn't get into Rwanda, and then the administration says, oh, we'll never do that again, or the opposite with Somalia.
Yeah, that's right.
A new president is a reset, and with that reset, the narrative has shifted some time. Now, people are waiting and looking at it. Will he even care about what is happening in Africa? Going back to the Bush era, even during already his campaign, he defined already his view about Africa. So that's what we have not seen in any policy making in New York. He already have defined that, say that basically we are going to be a global citizen. We'll help our neighbor. However, they have to be accountable for the help. Yeah. And that's the policy that brought the MCC, basically.
It's not just what you do, it's also what you say.
Yeah, and it was defined at the get-go.
By a principle that you can follow. So
yes, there is no principle here that we have. That's the issue.
Africa today offers the highest return on direct investment in the world. Where there's high risk, returns must be higher. Otherwise, no investor would come. But in Africa, the perceived risk far outweighs the real risk. The reason? It's the narrative. Poverty and unrest is not unique to Africa. China, India, even America, they all have poverty. But the narratives on those regions have long been more complex, incorporating business, arts, culture, and more. Until recently, the narrative on Africa was simplistic. It was a lie by omission, and it came at a cost: the ability to attract investment, promote tourism, host major events, and so much more. Language matters, especially when it comes from those who have a global platform. So this global platform is not just the White House. It's also NGOs that have been promoting an image of the starving African. It's also investors who don't want to talk about it because they're getting such great deals and they don't want others coming to compete.
The narrative affect us, affect our countries, especially in the commercial aspect of things. And this is, like you say, those three actors, the major multinationals, the NGOs, and also basically the government people, they have built an infrastructure around the old narrative. We have to help Africa, we are the world, we have to help Africa narrative. And they have a hard time moving away from that narrative, despite the fact that things are moving in a very positive direction. I mean, you're talking about corruption in Africa. I mean, I've seen corruption in other parts of the world worse than what is happening in Africa. Yes, but yet you put an emphasis on those things. It hurt a lot of countries.
Yeah, I think that's right. But Africa is not, we say this a lot, Africa is not a country. They have to think about each market and think about them differently. And what happened last year, actually, just to mark the different way that I think multinationals are thinking about doing business there, was when Jeff Immelt, the CEO of GE, said that they are going to do $6 billion worth of business in Africa in 2016. And that hit the business community like a wave. They said, well, boy, if GE is in there doing $6 billion worth of business, there must be a lot of opportunity there that we should be going in and following after.
While you're talking about GE, in Nigeria, they have put the largest power plant in the world. They never talk about it until, and that's what going back to the narrative situation, until Obama decided that Africa is good for business. Then they're talking about it like it was a hidden secret.
But I think that started in 2009 when the World Cup was occurring. Africa is not going to wait for the US.
Definitely not.
It's going to keep on going. So the campaign for Africa's growth, the African narrative, Africans are going to continue writing their own narrative. If the US is looking at the international order to its own benefit, it has to look at Africa and change willingly the narrative of Africa. From a policy perspective, there's a new synergy that needs to be
But
created.
Rahel, from the point of view of the U.S., I do think that we need a campaigner in chief.
Indeed, I do agree. I fully agree with you. I fully agree with
You see it from our business
fully
dealing in Africa. Only way U.S. corporations decide on the country is when the government is like, okay, this is good country. I mean, look at it. How many CEO are trying to go to Africa? The first thing they do, they look at the website of the State Department.
Yeah.
Right.
And they look at outdated information about the state of the country. And they'll tell you basically, based on that quick search, less than 5 seconds search, they'll tell you, I can go.
Yeah.
You know, another thing that I see is that when you have factories in other places, people say, oh, isn't that wonderful that India is now manufacturing this? When you show people pictures of factories in Africa, people say, oh, they're exploiting them. Oh, it's sweatshops.
Yeah.
It's job creation.
Yeah. I think that
Why does the narrative
It's a
become so
double standard
different?
I think that understanding needs to be, it really needs to be developed as much as possible for Africa, because we want to see as much investment go in as possible. And there are amazing opportunities, not just so that you can create things in Africa and sell it to the world, but even just within Africa. It's an enormous economy. And there is a developing middle class with discretionary income. America is not going to be great again if it's not in Africa. It needs to be in there and be a part of what's happening.
The narrative in the U.S. on China going to Africa is how awful they're doing that. They're not concerned about governance, and they're just stealing from those Africans as if Africans can't negotiate good deals. Meanwhile, Africans are getting roads, they're getting infrastructure, they're getting all these
And then
things.
again, if you're thinking that they're exploiting Africa, why don't you get to the game and live
That's the way to do it.
and
That's
raise the
exactly the
game?
point.
That's exactly
So, I mean, that's again this type of narrative that is self-serving narrative. I usually tell people that certain people were in the Africa business before Africa became sexy in the US. And those people understand that the risk is overplayed.
Russia has corruption. Russia has unrest. Russia has all the things that they talk about in Africa, but it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter because
It's the narrative.
If I was an African head of state going in to see the president and say, like, where is the Trump Tower in Africa, right? Where are you going to put a Trump hotel in Africa? When can we see that? And put it on terms that he understands and explain to him that there are customers there and that might help change the narrative.
African countries are increasingly seeing the benefits of owning their brand. There's Ghana on the go, remarkable Rwanda, Ethiopia's 13 months of sunshine, magical Kenya, and South Africa inspiring new ways. Throughout Africa, rebranding is the new buzzword. And it's not just at a country level. Facebook, Twitter, blogging, and YouTube, like people everywhere, Africans no longer wait for the media to tell their story. Aside from Africa's own efforts, others contribute to the narrative, like government leaders in China and India who focus on Africa's business opportunities. In today's crowded communications landscape, no one owns the narrative. And at last, Africa's narrative is becoming as nuanced as it always should have been. So, Rahel, how do you see Africans owning their own narrative?
Well, I think technology provides the platform for us to tell the narrative on both sides, both in terms of America doing its business in Africa and Africans doing business in the US, and even Africans what Africa is in terms of their GDP growth, economic growth, the consumer purchasing power growth, the population. So all of beyond that as well, talking about the culture, the beauty of the culture. So it has. Information communication technology has completely changed the way we interact. And so today, Africa, obviously there's no connectivity, electricity, and so on. Even those infrastructures.
And yet everyone has a cell phone.
Indeed.
Yes.
And they still are able to go on Facebook and tweet. And there are some governments now, they're starting to say, how can we produce our own content and utilize the technology to disseminate it and also engage with others?
You know, Ambassador, certainly cell phones have changed a lot for what Africans have access to. But you were talking also about culturally, how things have really changed as far as Africans owning their own narrative.
You see the young people are very active now, and standing there on cell phone, tweeting, or tooting their own horn, which some 10 years back ago, I would sit with head of state in Africa trying to help them understand that it's important that you talk about their story. Some of them, some prominent head of state told me, listen, we are a culture, Bantu culture, and usually we don't toot our own horn. But nobody hearing you because nobody's really focusing on your needs. But now I think that is shifting. People are creating the narrative, but we need to do more, really, in Africa, because we have a timid approach on creating the narrative. The narrative is not necessarily about what you are. It probably has to be forward-looking. It's about what you want to become. And like I say in business, fake it until you make it. And it's important. It is important. We need to forecast. We need to shape the narrative that is forward-looking narrative. And we need to actively promote that narrative.
And get beyond the culture that says, don't go out and talk
don't
about
go out and
yourself.
talk about
Don't
yourself.
start every sentence with I.
Yes.
And meanwhile, you're reading me as Americans, or me.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how complex the media landscape is now. How do you even get heard?
Yeah, well, it is harder because there are more. There's more sources of news information and more people producing. More people producing content, which is great and amazing. They're producing really fantastic things, but we are segmenting ourselves in terms of how we see it. We're here in Washington. We spend a lot of time in capitals and talking about what governments do and what presidents do. The truth is, most people in the world they're focused on culture,
yes.
right? They love their movies and sport and entertainment and food. We could obsess on food all day long and those things, I actually think, have the greater opportunity to break through. If you've been to West Africa, right, you love West African music and Malian music, and you know that it's amazing, and people aren't hearing it everywhere.
Yes.
They're starting to hear it now. You go to, all of the various different, food cultures in Africa, which are unbelievable, and I think that has a great opportunity to break through. The Ghanaian soccer team does a lot to sell Africa. It does a lot. It's great. Yeah.
They're definitely goodwill ambassadors.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, it's also interesting when you talk about West African music. This idea of attaching the place in Africa with something that we all like. I've always thought like Mozambican shrimp.
Yeah.
But we need to attach the country with it so we see that the origin is from there.
And this type of branding, it is true that each part of Africa has a cultural or some certain characteristic that can be branded effectively for the whole community.
So regionalization is also important in the narrative.
It is important.
But the issue of branding, according to regionalization, gets back to that issue of, do we talk about Africa as a continent? And then people say, it's not just one thing, it's country by country. Which one do you do?
We don't have to,
we
don't
have
have to really renew that because we in the US we're dealing with Europe. When it's convenient to us, we talk about Europe as a whole. However, when we're about to define the policy, we say France, we say Russia. So I don't think we need to reinvent anything in case of Africa. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
It's simpler than we think.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of the countries have to brand themselves individually.
Yes.
Then there's the regional, and then there's the continent. So it's a multi-layered effect. Also, it's an opportune time for Africans to own their narrative and say, this is what we want out of the U.S. This is our strategy for the U.S.
Let's take some questions from our viewers. Pauline in Manassas, Virginia asks, we're in an era where African culture and narratives are celebrated in things such as our hairdos, fashion, music, and more. But the problem is when the Western media tries to make it their own. Why are we allowing this to happen? So, Rahel, this really gets to cultural appropriation and Africa owning the narrative and the beauty that is theirs. It's sort of an aspect that when people start to like it, they pull it away from Africa and start branding it somewhere else.
Yes. It's a difficult question to answer because appropriation has been going on for centuries. And so in terms of for African culture, the hairdos and so on and so forth, you know, a great example is the one company, which I won't name, used the Ethiopian dresses and actually branded it as their own and started selling it. And so there was an uproar, and then they started doing petitions and so on and so forth. And then the goodwill of the company, they took it off the shelves. So the cultural appropriation discussion comes when Africans themselves have to start branding and actually start creating their own brands. And we cannot fight, you know, I call it the petty fight in a sense, because you cannot fight a whole society because they're using the same hairdo as you. We appreciate our cultures, embrace it, and be flattered that actually we're being imitated.
If I may add something to what you said. A couple of days ago, my son bought me a dashiki, and with a hood on it. First, I found it strange that the dashiki has a hood.
Yes.
And then I look at it, and it was Korean made.
Yes, yes.
You see, because with dashiki, everybody is appropriating dashiki. But who has the intellectual property of that? You create it, you protect it, and you market it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Indeed.
I think I understand this, that we need to have sensitivity on cultural appropriation. But what the borrowing does to me is it allows people to become comfortable with other cultures, and I think that's probably on balance for the better.
Yes.
And last, Jonathan in Nairobi, Kenya asks, Africa is now an important investment frontier, and it's seen that way throughout the world, except for in the U.S. Why? And what needs to happen to change that? So, Ambassador, this is certainly what you've been involved with for a long time.
Definitely. And what needs to happen is simple, that it has to be a mind shift with the corporate leader here in the U.S. And I think if it doesn't happen willingly, it will happen to them reluctantly. Just because of the fact, you look at the return on investment anywhere in the world, you still have double-digit return on investment in Africa. This is, for me, is a compelling reason for any businessman to want to go to Africa. That's one thing. I think that's what needs to happen. But also, Africans need to trade within Africa, because profit is something that people desire. And how do you get to a point where you desire profit? Is when you see your neighbors getting rich in a situation, you start to like, okay, I need to go over there.
Yeah.
If people are commercing intra-Africa and basically creating wealth within Africa, other people will pay attention. And I think we need more of the African businessmen raising their own profile and investing better in the continent. And that will attract more investors from outside the continent.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of our program. Thank you so much to my guests, Tony Fratto, Rahel Gatachew, and
Thank you
Omar
very much.
Brunel.
Thank you.
To our viewers in Africa, America, and around the world, thank you so much for joining us.